good. Well, a very warm welcome from myself. Some of you, but not everybody, I think, because I see quite a few unfamiliar names, which is always good, will know something of who I am and what this project Insiders Outsiders is all about. But for those of you who haven't come across the project, if I may, I'll just start by saying a few words about it. It's a project that I initiated already a few years ago, believe it or not, but it took the form of a in-person nationwide year-long arts festival. It was March 2019 to March 2020, which celebrated across all the art forms the immensely rich, pervasive, profound contribution made by refugees from Nazi Europe to this country's culture. And then COVID hit in March 2020, as we all know too well, and luckily the festival was coming to an end anyway. And the obvious thing, and indeed it gave the whole project an unexpectedly rich, afterlife, was to initiate a program, an ongoing program of online events. And of course, this event tonight, which I'm very much looking forward to, is part of that. I should also add that I've made something of a habit, if that's the right word, of making that Monday evening slot one particularly reserved for a kind of more personal view of some of the wonderful artists, creative people that the festival has been celebrating over the last few years, in that it's often family members who are going to be doing the talking. So without further ado, you all know the topic of this evening's talk. I will introduce both the people you can see here highlighted for convenience, a tribute to Leon Vilaincour, I have to pronounce it the French way, but we'll hear more about the name changes and the implications of that later on. A wonderful artist, I think not sufficiently known today, but for those of you who are not familiar with his work, I think we'll have a treat in store. So I'm just omitting a few more. Good. Make sure everybody, if you wouldn't mind, I think, is there somebody called Andrea Rayner? I'm afraid not muted. If you could make absolutely sure that you're all muted, I'd be really grateful. And you all, as I say, you know the ropes, but what we'll do afterwards, after Piers here has finished talking, and indeed even while he's talking, if you have any questions or comments that you'd like to fire at him later on, write them in the first instance, if you would, type them into the chat function, which I will then keep a beady eye on and relay the questions towards the end. Equally, if you'd like to speak in person, then you might like to just say so in the chat, and we can arrange that, I'm sure. Very good. So let me start actually by introducing not Piers himself, who's going to do most of the talking, but actually his wife, who is the one who is directly connected in a very intimate way with the subject of today's session, Maria Vilaincour Baker. I will quote what she herself has sent me eloquently, the daughter of two artists, not just one, Leon Julius, but also Roberta Cameron Smith, about whom I think we will hear a little bit later on. She grew up in London, in her own words, surrounded by canvases and the smell of oil paint, as indeed many artists' children would identify with. Professionally speaking, she's a paper conservator restorer, specializing in the conservation of works of art on paper, including prints, drawings and watercolors, and in museum mounting and the preservation of collections. She's currently an independent conservator working from her studio in West London. Previously, she worked in both private conservation studios and also in museums. She trained at Camberwell School of Art and then set up the first paper conservation studio for the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool. I could go on, well, I will go on, all right. She's had her own conservation businesses in Brussels and also Canterbury, and worked at the Albertina in Vienna before returning to London. Her academic background is in classics and art history, and she's married, as I think you've really sussed out for yourselves, to Piers Baker, who will be giving the more formal presentation, and they have 3 grown-up sons. Very good. So I'm now going to tell you a little bit about Piers Baker himself, again quoting from information that he sent me. He spent 20 years in the diplomatic service with postings in Brussels and Vienna before moving to academic administration as the director of international office at Imperial College London, and latterly working as clerk to one of the City of London's livery companies, the Tin Plate Elias Y Workers. Wonderful, something quite alien and foreign to me, but it sounds fascinating, leaving at the end of 2021. His academic background is rather different. It's in cultural history and archaeology. He worked as a research fellow at the British Institute of Afghan Studies in Kabul in the late 1970s, and completed a PhD on the cultural and historical context of the colossal Buddhas that I think we all know something about, because they were, of course, destroyed by the Taliban in Afghanistan's Bamiyan Valley. He's maintained his interest in archaeology of the area, including participation in a recent British Museum research project. Cutting to the chase for tonight's subject, he's for some years now been preparing a digital catalogue of his father-in-law Leon Vilaincour's oil paintings, now being expanded to include his watercolours and other materials, as well as the work of Vilaincour's wife, the artist Roberta Cameron. So it's with very great pleasure, Piers, that I'm going to hand over to you, absent myself from centre stage, and welcome. You're going to share screen, yeah?
Thank you very much, Monica, and welcome to everyone to this talk about the life and work of my late father-in-law, the artist and teacher Leon Vilaincour. And since I don't see frantic waving, I assume that my screen is successfully being shared with you.
It's absolutely fine.
So here he is, shown in his studio in a photograph taken in 1992 by George Newsom. I'll be giving a generally chronological account, illustrated primarily through his oil paintings, which developed over the years through a series of distinct styles and themes, many of which drew on personal experiences and interests. To start at the beginning, he was born in Krakow in 1923 of a Polish mother and an Austro-Hungarian father, his name at birth being Julius Leon Pauker. His father, an officer in the Austro-Hungarian army, we see here in a photograph from 1911, and his mother wearing hat and veil from a photograph taken in Vienna, where before the First World War, she learned dressmaking and modelled dresses. Sadly, Leon's father left the family while he was young, moving to the United States, though he remained in touch with the family, as appears in several of Leon's paintings of the 1970s and 1980s. Leon was brought up in a flat in this building, which is still standing in Krakow, by his mother and several aunts. The family business was dressmaking, and Leon's mother travelled regularly to Paris to see the latest fashions and buy fabrics. This is significant since by the 1930s, his mother had settled in Paris. And in 1938, being from an assimilated Jewish family, she sent Leon to England for his safety. Very few of the family were to survive the Second World War. Leon last visited Poland in 1939, never to return, though his attachment remained. He never forgot his Polish heritage, continuing to read Polish literature, particularly poetry and newspapers, and taking a keen interest when his daughter Maria, who has been introduced to you and will be joining me in answering any questions a little later, and I first visited Krakow in the 1990s. We will see that many visual references to themes and individuals from Polish and also Austro-Hungarian and French history appear in his paintings. But at this point, I'm showing you the only one explicitly referring to the city of his birth. It is also a painting that exemplifies the character of much of his work. What may initially appear largely abstract is actually made up of a number of figurative elements that emerge as one looks more closely. I won't try to elucidate all the elements in this painting, but for those who know Krakow, we have the trumpeter who plays the St. Mary's trumpet call from the highest tower, St. Mary's Basilica, still. His head here, the trumpet extending to the right here, and written below the notes of his interrupted trumpet call. After a not very happy time at a boarding school in Hove, Leon was accepted in 1940 for study at the Central School of Arts and Crafts, as it then was, though he soon went to the offices of the Free French government in exile to volunteer to join their army. However, he was not considered sufficiently French to qualify, and even an indirect appeal to de Gaulle whose voice he heard in the next room didn't secure admission. So he joined the British Army, and it was in this connection that he changed his name from the German-sounding Pauker to Vilaincour, perhaps just as well for someone so unsuited to being a soldier. He was spared active service by being concussed while on manoeuvres in 1944, which led to a spell in hospital and then his discharge. After the war, he returned to the Central School with an ex-services scholarship in the graphics department. And from about this time, we have dust jackets that he's designed for books published by OUP and Methuen, and these illustrations from the cultural magazine Our Time. He also contributed this striking wood engraving to a work produced by students in the Central School Book Production Department that was displayed in the Arts and Crafts Exhibition Society's show at the Guildhall Art Gallery in the spring of 1948. He soon moved on to a teaching post at the Central School and then to one at the St. John Cass College. These two self-portraits from this period are the earliest paintings that we have. And indeed, we have very little other material from the 1940s, though we know that his portraiture was admired and he received some commissions. While at the Central School, he met Roberta Cameron Smith, born in New Zealand of Welsh and Scottish parents. She was studying painting and history of art and supporting her studies with work as a woodcarver, including on the post-war restoration of pews in St. Paul's Cathedral. They were married in 1948 and remained married for nearly 68 years, Roberta dying just 2 months before Leon. In 1950, Leon joined the staff, which included notable other emigres of Chelsea School of Art, where he taught part-time until his retirement at the age of 65 in 1988, and where, to quote from his obituary by Richard Morford in the Sunday Telegraph, quote, he helped students to find themselves rather than be swept away by fashionable conformity, unquote. And in parallel with his teaching, he continued to paint in oils and watercolors and increasingly in mixed media, including collage. More work survives from the 1950s, particularly paintings, sorry, I skipped on one, particularly paintings inspired by scenes around Damary-les-Lys, a small rural village near Barbizon in the forest of Fontainebleau, where Leon and Roberta spent much of the summers with Leon's mother and one surviving aunt, all illustrated in the painting on the right, Roberta on the balcony and his mother and aunt in the garden below. We have seen references to him receiving a commission for the Festival of Britain, and he had a one-man show at the Berkeley Gallery in 1955. But the first edition that we can at present document was at the New Arts Centre in Sloane Street in 1964. He recalled that the exhibition was supported by Lawrence Gowing, who took the then director of the Tate, John Rothenstein, who wanted to buy a painting, but Rothenstein then left the Tate. And it was some years before this eventually happened. Leon also recalled that Henry Moore went to the exhibition and signed the visitor's book. The exhibition presented 18 paintings. 2 were bought by the Arts Council, of which this very large-scale work, the Chalice, over 1 metre by 1.5 metres, hung in the auditorium of the Purcell Room on the South Bank for a long time during the 1990s. And that made it even more of a pleasure for us to go to concerts there at the time. This is typical of the works of the period, and indeed of many later works, in appearing abstract, but in fact being built upon or containing a specific representational element or elements, in this case, the chalice of the title. Sadly, we don't know what happened to most of the other paintings in the exhibition, though we know that Leon painted over at least 2 in later years. Here is Purification, as shown at the New Arts Centre, and here it is overpainted in 2000 as Door of the Night, where the only element to remain immediately recognisable is this blue-framed arch or doorway in the centre of the painting. This demonstrates the startling change in style over the years from the New Art Centre exhibition, this one nearly 40 years later, and that takes us rather too far in one jump. So we'll now look at how Vilaincour got there. As a stepping stone, here we have a painting from the early 1970s and itself reworked some 8 years later, ahead of two one-man exhibitions in the early 1980s at the Knoedler Kasmin Gallery in Cork Street in 1982 and at the Serpentine Gallery in Hyde Park in 1983. The works on display at the two exhibitions overlapped, so we will look at the body of work as one and can also consider the reactions to it as a single group. This quotation, which helps to explain the change, comes from an interview in the Serpentine catalogue with Nick Wadley, then head of art history at Chelsea. I'll read a longer section of the passage from which it comes. Paintings are static things. They hang on walls. They are often one enormous disappointment when compared to the ideas that precede them. And it reached a point where I thought, this won't do. When I saw my exhibition in 1964, I thought, that's the end. I will have nothing more to do with that kind of work, because I was far more interested in the idea than in the art. If one was interested in narrative, illustrative painting, how does one find the means of realizing it? I had to start from scratch, from practical things. I thought the most logical and most agreeable thing to do would be to discard most of the 20th century and the last third, if not half, of the 19th century. The result, as Nick Wadley observed, was, quote, paintings which are so deeply, passionately rooted in facts of European history, that are at the same time subject only to the logic of the painter's intuitions and imagination. He affirms, for instance, there is no chronology to the references. Events and personalities cross each other unknowingly, yet forming a total network, unquote. Here then, in this painting, we see figures from European, predominantly Polish, Austro-Hungarian and French history, with, in the center, Polish troops behind a frontier barrier. Framing devices of mirrors or windows with beveled glass appear around many of the separate images, as well as backgrounds or frames of pearls, devices which appear in many of the paintings of this period, derived from pearl backgrounds to Russian Orthodox icons, and which in themselves became the subject of individual works. Similar themes appear in this painting, where images of Vilaincour's father appear at the top right and bottom center, along with historical figures, and this time with Napoleonic cuirassier in the central section, and the appearance of an enigmatic 18th century figure on stilts in a marsh, who made his way into several paintings of this period. Vilaincour explains the title in this quotation from the catalogue, a statement of the process that is characteristic of his work. The characters' paths cross unknowingly. I make my own order. And here we have another painting drawing on Napoleonic elements, besides which I've placed a nice quotation from the introduction to the catalogue by another of Vilaincour's colleagues at Chelsea, the painter Miles Murphy. Contemporary critical reaction to the exhibitions was starkly varied. The eminent Times critic John Russell Taylor clearly had difficulty getting to grips with what he saw, and I'm not sure that he liked Messiaen either. On the other hand, Terence Mullally, writing in the Telegraph of the Knoedler Kasmin show, declared, quote, an exhibition which offers an indictment of the London art world is now being shown by Kasmin at the Knoedler Gallery. It is one of the most haunting one-man shows seen in London for a long time. It seems strange, looking at his latest exhibition, that he has not been acclaimed, unquote. Another critic who became a firm supporter initially through the Knoedler Kasmin show was Mel Gooding, who then gave a number of talks accompanying the Serpentine exhibition. He began his review, quote, "It is a remarkable artist who, seemingly unaffected by the spirit of the time or the styles that serve it most clamorously, persists in the solitary pursuit of a personal vision whose meanings may remain even to himself mysterious, and yet whose realization is undeniably imperative," unquote. Vilaincour was particularly grateful for Mel Gooding's support at this time. Before moving on, I'd like to show you two more very striking works from the exhibitions. Firstly, Vanitas, as it was displayed at the Serpentine in a rather old slide, a polyptych that stretches some 5 meters. The theme is earthly vanity and the futility of war. A juxtaposition of military symbols, Napoleonic eagles, swords, decorations, with skulls, as at the bottom of these two panels. And in the right-hand panel, below the eagle, hanging helmet and sword, black-edged envelopes symbolizing notices of bereavement to addresses in Poland. And finally, from these shows, this striking diptych. On the left, St. Michael with spear and dragon, on the right with a pair of scales and wings. And in the windows at the sides, or seen in the mirrors, on the left of each redemption, and on the right, Vilaincour said, noting that there were no identifiable characters, hell, or at least purgatory. But by way of complete contrast, and to illustrate one thing that does not come out from these very intense oil paintings, is Vilaincour's lively sense of humor, which we see, for example, in an alphabet he created for his grandsons, in which he matched both the name and the image of the letter, and both the name and the shape of the letter, of the image to the letter in question. And here we have a somewhat hobbit-shaped door, icicles hanging from the mouth of a cave, an M-shaped mountain, and a zigzag of lightning over a Paris skyline. While producing these, he was, of course, continuing to paint more large-scale works, of which 26 oil paintings and 21 watercolors were presented at an exhibition at the Rai Art Gallery in 1992. Once again, and purely for reasons of time, I will concentrate on the oil paintings while regretting not being able to do justice to his parallel output of watercolors. This powerful, or the powerful triptych Ritterhalle, of which this is the right-hand panel, shows a preoccupation with themes from European history, continuing from the exhibition of the 1980s, and here specifically referencing the Second World War, with two images of Churchill in profile and full face below, de Gaulle in his 1930s uniform when a colonel in the French army, Jörg van Wattenberg, a German plotter against Hitler, to the left. At the top right, Raoul Wallenberg and the Polish soldier, resistance fighter and diplomat Jan Karski. And also with the very personal inclusion of his mother and aunt, for whom the conflict and the fate of Polish Jews remained such a vivid link. As Paddy Kitchen wrote in a review in Country Life, the exhibition demonstrated how Vilaincour has heroically recreated in entirely his own terms the teeming history of his life and learning. Kitchen also commented how these paintings, quote, demonstrated a new boldness and freedom in the use of colour, unquote. And as the poet and artist Martha Karposh, I'm very pleased to see her with us this evening, noted in her introduction to the catalogue, rather than the individually framed images we saw before, in these paintings, images impinge on each other, are more tightly fused and emerged from a more unified surface. Not all the paintings were by any means this somber. Vilaincour described this one as a joke. Here we have art students coming back from a party wearing masks with the captain of Rembrandt's Night Watch, second from the right. As Martha Karposh commented, quote, as spectators, we don't immediately see what these painting surfaces contain, where one image is distinct from another, or how a definite and separate identity is brought into existence. There is a slow unfolding, unquote. That is clearly difficult when one is looking at these images of large-scale canvases, here again 1.5 meters wide, on a small screen. So this is looking a little bit more closely at the upper part of this painting, the students' masked faces below, under the stern gaze of the captain of the night watch. His partisan, the polearm, the weapon that he carries in the original, taken out of his hands and placed at a diagonal above their heads. On the left, a lantern with faceted glass lights and chandeliers with candles with their wicks extinguished along the top. In another quotation in the introduction to the catalogue, Vilaincour is recorded as saying that the details of things as well as people, quote, come from unknown quarters. A rightly thought out painting is a painting which begins to rethink itself by itself, and the painter is no more, unquote. The earliest painting shown in the Rye exhibition was this diptych, A Life, which Vilaincour presented to the Tate Gallery in 1997. There's a detailed commentary in the Tate's online catalogue, drawing on conversations and letters from the time, together with representations of the artist's friends and family and the self-portrait here in the right-hand canvas. We once again see individuals from history and references to the ways in which his family was affected by the history, in particular, of the 20th century. At the top right-hand corner of the left panel is an inscription written in Polish and Ukrainian in very small letters, which can be translated as, perhaps one day they will return, master and horse. Vilaincour said this came from the penultimate line of a short story about a bankrupt landowner who is forced to sell his property but instead abandons it, fleeing on his favorite horse. The final line of the story is, but they never returned. Vilaincour said of the story that, I thought it summarized this painting. The catalogue entry comments, it is notable that Vilaincour omitted the final line of the story, suggesting that he wanted to keep open the question of whether those who are gone will return. Paddy Kitchen concluded the Country Life review that I quoted earlier by saying that Vilaincour did not yet think his paintings had enough radiance in them of life, of love, and that was an aspect that he wanted to develop. As we move on through his career, we can reflect on how far he achieved that. Very few of his paintings since the Rye exhibition have in fact been publicly seen until now, but there is one major exception, painted 10 years after A Life and purchased by the Tate in the year that A Life was presented to it, is 1804 to 1995. We think that this work was previously shown at an exhibition at Glasgow's Gallery of Modern Art of works shortlisted for Glasgow's Lord Provost's Prize in 1996, but confirmation of that is one of the tasks for our continuing research. We do once again, though, have a detailed catalogue entry from the Tate, drawing on the artist's comments at the time, as well as a detailed technical description. The title, Vilaincour said, quote, simply means that the objects included come from the year of the founding of the empire in France up to the year when this picture was made. They include details of a Napoleonic adjutant general's uniform, Polish cavalry pennants, 2 early 20th century Belgian accordions, and coloured bulbs and shell-like light shades as in an actor's dressing room. The catalogue entry notes that the whole of this scene is supposed to be underwater. Vilaincour wanted it to seem beyond reach, an effect he achieved in this painting through the whirling blue lines, rows of floating bubbles, sinuous seaweed-like ribbons, and accumulations of encrusted dots. This painting was exhibited at Tate Britain to mark Vilaincour's 80th birthday in 2003, and again as a memorial on his death in March 2016. And here we see Maria standing beside it in the display on that occasion. But why, to pick out one element from this painting that we haven't come across before, accordions? From around the time of the Rye exhibition, Vilaincour largely abandoned references to the 19th century and produced work on a variety of 20th century themes, with a series of paintings developing each theme in turn, interspersed with other freestanding work. Partly this drew on his reading, but partly too on visits to stay with his daughter and family in Brussels in the 1980s and 1990s, and in Vienna in the 2000s. Accordions provided one of the first of these themes, accurately depicted in this image on the right, and often also with makers' names, but again, only one of a number of elements forcing their way into each individual painting. So here we see the accordion on the right, overlain with an LP and with another LP down in the bottom left-hand corner. But Sergeant A.R., this is Vilaincour's cousin, Adolphe Rosner, the profile of his face extending from the bellows of the accordion in this area here, and with a military cap on his head, leaning forwards. But perhaps you've still not yet seen him. So here he is, taken out of the painting and placed upright, where I think the profile of his face in red with his eye here, nose, mouth, and the military cap will become rather clearer. Moving on, this vivid painting, Seven Horseshoes, is inspired by a poem by the 20th century Polish poet Kazimierz Wierzyński. A verse in Polish is written out at top left, translated at the bottom corner. 7 horseshoes glint on a doorstep, 7 cast spells, grasshopper by them enormous, heron, linnet, and marmot. The creatures are all depicted here in the painting. Here we have a line of horseshoes overlain by the enormous grasshopper, and to the right, the heron, the linnet, and the marmot, his head sticking up here. The marmot probably suggested the idea represented here in the center of the painting, identified, though it is not a literal representation, by the words Fontana Cistaina, with a spring in the mountains of the Lower Engadine in Switzerland. One series that Vilaincour first developed between 1999 and 2001 was variously named Carnaval and Jeux d'hiver, Autumn, Winter, or Northern Rites, and was inspired by an exhibition at the Pompidou Center in Paris in the early 1980s of photographs of bygone rural customs. Typically, the series represented ideas or moods rather than being depictions, though some elements emerge straight away from these two examples. Here we have a red jug, stacked loaves of round bread. Here, a hanging glass candle holder with the candle burning, attracting moths to the light. On the right, in a slightly later version of the theme, another jug, a decorated jug with wooden spoons, above a fiery griddle with bread rolls, we think, being cooked on it. Down here, the outline of a wolf's head. Some individual items, including that wolf's head, appear in this strikingly different painting where the central theme is all too clear, to an extent echoing Millet's well-known painting in the Tate Gallery. The wolf I mentioned, but here overlying Ophelia's body are water lilies, her head here and her hair streaming out to the right. Kermesse with Flanders and Vienna, or Vienna and Flanders, is one of a relatively small number of paintings where we have oral descriptions of various elements. A small number of descriptions, not least because Vilaincour was often reluctant to catalogue, as it were, the various items that went into a composition. preferring to let the end result speak visually for itself. On this occasion, though, he said that at the bottom, in the bottom part was an idea of a traditional Flemish merry-go-round with life-size figures represented on the mechanical organ, and behind horses and other animals for children to ride on. There is an unconnected strip of herring or mackerel, a reflection of fish markets and restaurants, and at the top right, Flemish buildings and roof lines. On the left, the interior of a Viennese cafe. As such, it provides a visual link between his series of French and Flemish themes and a series inspired by Viennese cafe culture. Real Coffee is a series painted between 2003 and 2006, of which this is an early example. Again, we don't see direct depictions, but Vilaincour's evocation of his feelings of the atmosphere of Vienna's artistic and intellectual past, centered in or mirrored in its cafes, some with identifiable portraits of individuals brought together, again out of his imagination, rather than out of any historical connection. And the series is not simply an idealization. The left-hand panel includes, quote, to add grit, unquote, Vilaincour said. On the left, a portrait of Stefan Zweig, with his suicide note regretting the loss of the past Europe, written out here in full. Yet there is also, at the top left, a stork's nest with a parent bird feeding its chicks, described by Vilaincour as a symbol of renewal, of coming back to normality. This is one of the specific paintings that Vilaincour discussed in a series of interviews recorded at this time with the art historian Linda Sandino for Artists' Lives, part of the National Life Stories Oral History Project based at the British Library. The recordings are available on the British Library website with summaries of the content. And again, we're very pleased to see that Linda has joined us this evening. These interviews were then the subject of an article in the National Life Stories annual report for 2005-06 by Richard Morford, formerly keeper of the modern collection at the Tate Gallery, whose obituary I've referred to before, and who again we think we're very pleased to have seen that he is with us here this evening too. This article draws out the essence of the personal background worked into his art, including a comment on the powerful way that the tapes demonstrate how, in Vilaincour's case, displacement was the very mainspring of a rich and unusual vision. We can feel this again in the next series I would like to illustrate briefly, painted from 2008 to 2011. The theme is drawn from the ancient satire of the Ship of Fools, going back to Plato's Republic, about a ship with a dysfunctional crew. It is also the title of the 1962 novel by Catherine Ann Porter and subsequent film about a disparate group of characters sailing from Mexico to Europe aboard a German passenger ship, an allegory tracing the rise of Nazism and looking metaphorically at the progress of the world on its voyage to eternity. In this painting, the bright colours of the blue and red fish below and on the boat itself contrast with what one sees when looking more closely, between a steif bear on the left and a scow looking backwards from the bows of the ship, representing the passage from childhood to death. We see in an image that harks back to that Flemish kermesse in the earlier painting, all having a merry-go-round on the ship. Quite unmistakable in its mood, though, is this painting, taking as its title the encyclical of Pope Pius XI, issued in March 1937 to be read in German churches, expressing concern at Nazi attacks on the Catholic Church. Vilaincour recalled that the encyclical was viewed with excitement and optimism by the Jewish community in Poland. and in particular his mother commenting on it in those terms. The image, though, is of the railway line to Auschwitz. Following on from the Ships of Fools series are two other linked series that pick up again the idea of Carnival and winter rites, originally prompted by that 1980s Pompidou Centre photographic exhibition of rural customs. But while there are still individual elements to find in these pictures, the idea is expressed through colour and mood, perhaps reminiscent more in this respect of some of the earliest semi-abstract paintings that were displayed 50 years earlier at the New Arts Centre. But these works are so unmistakably different in the vibrant use of colour and the intensity of the images. The same abstract feel is true of a series from 2013 that took its title from Schubert's song cycle Winterreise. Though here in the right-hand panel, we have the helpful legend Paris Nord Départ, partially hidden by the rain falling diagonally across the canvas. And this, not inappropriately, brings us almost to the end of our story. Leon continued to paint for the remaining 3 years of his life, but increasingly in watercolours, though he was in the process of ordering more canvas. And his last oil paintings were still on his easels when he died. As Richard Morford wrote in the obituary in the Telegraph that I referred to earlier, when Vilaincour died, he was, quote, full of plans for new work and always hoping that he would become better known, unquote. We are very grateful for the opportunity that Monica and Insiders Outsiders have given us this evening to move things in that direction.
And would you like to stop screen sharing, and hopefully there will be some questions coming in. I've certainly got many things I would like to broach. Good. As I said in my message, please, now is the moment to start typing in your questions, or I think probably best to do that, and then I can see if you want to actually ask them yourselves. Where to start? Okay, so nice. Let's see what's coming in here. I don't know if you can actually see them yourself. Lots of, yes, plaudits there. Where to start? I suppose as an art historian myself, my first question, which actually sort of ties in with the one sort of specific question we've had thus far, which comes from Sally Knowles, which goes, can we have some background into the inspiration of his subject matter? Really, iconographically, these are rich, densely packed images, and that's obviously one side of the coin, as it were, but also technically speaking, in terms of the actual process, the making of the images, there's a lot that you haven't shared with us. And I wonder if perhaps you could start with that, and whether it's you or maybe somebody else in the audience who, I think there's at least one lady, am I right, who was actually a student of Leon, might like to give some insights into the technical processes and indeed the media, the very rich array of media that he employed. Could we perhaps start with that? Piers, or indeed Maria, maybe it's your turn to chip in.
Well, of course, he did a lot of traveling around Europe. Mm-hmm. And as a child, he traveled to and fro very often between Krakow and Paris. Occasionally came to England, but mostly he was on the continent. He spent a lot of time drawing. In that he rather followed his mother's example, because she did a lot of drawing for her dressmaking, and he would go out. He didn't have the money to buy objects, but he would go to museums in Paris or back in Poland, and he had a very, very good visual memory. And that comes out very much later on. There's one painting which is called simply Count Morzynski's Boot. And I wondered for a long time why this was called this. Mm-hmm. I can't show it to you this time, but in the middle of it, there is a very detailed depiction of a large black leather boot. Piers very recently found precisely the portrait that my father must have seen decades earlier in Poland. And indeed, one of the boots is what he has put into his painting. So I think the subject matter is based very much on this very strong visual memory.
I think if I could add on one of the sources, particularly at the period when he was very interested in Napoleonic themes, he spent a lot of time drawing, sketching uniforms in the Musée de l'Armée in Paris. And although we haven't particularly illustrated it here, there is a lot of very precise depiction of contemporary costume, for example.
Which sort of begs the question, which immediately occurred to me, as I'm sure it did to many others, you know, as I say, it is rich, it's densely packed, it's enigmatic, it's the stuff of poetry rather than narrative in an explicit sense. To what extent was he willing? I mean, obviously there were occasions, as you quoted, where he was prepared to give explanations of his imagery, but was he for the most part reluctant to do so, feeling that the work should speak for itself?
Well, there again, if I could just a quick comment, he would say to me, look, I can explain to you what this element or that element is, what it's based on. But in fact, at the end of the day, what is important is that the painting speaks for itself. One must, either you like it or perhaps you don't like it, but it is a painting that has to stand on its own feet.
I suspected that would be the answer. I wonder if I could go back to my question about the actual techniques he employed. I don't know, Maria, whether you'd like to say something, or as I say, anybody in the audience who knew him, who perhaps even saw him at work, but Maria, do start the ball rolling. Tell us a little bit more about the actual way in which he worked and the materials he employed.
Well, he had how he worked at home. I mean, he had studios in our house and he would disappear off into the studios for a long time. There were lots of easels, lots of paint, lots of things going on there. And we would come in and out and have a look and see where he had got to. Yes, as I think I said earlier, there was a marvelous smell of oil paint that would pervade everywhere.
But it wasn't just oil paint, was it? I mean, there were lots of other materials incorporated into the surface of the work. And I wonder if one of you perhaps, or indeed, as I say, anybody else who'd like to chip in at this point might say a little bit more about that.
Certainly use of metallic paint early on, which I think was quite unpopular at the time. But then, as you will have seen, he returned to that as well. But also in many of the canvases, he was applying oil paint very thickly indeed. Because of time, as I said, we didn't show watercolors, but he also had a very distinctive and totally different watercolor technique. Not so much developing watercolors as sketches for oil paintings, much more parallel series. Some directly related to oil paintings, some freestanding. Again, it was particularly with the watercolor or the work on paper later on that he developed increasingly collage, more as blocks of color than incorporating visual devices with collage. But that again was something that he did use. I mentioned the Tate catalogue of the paintings there, and certainly with the 1804 to 1995 painting, there is an extremely detailed technical analysis of the work, which was very interesting to read.
So, and people can access that. That's on the website. I'd certainly urge people to do that. Okay, there's quite a sort of matter-of-fact question here from Laura Brandon. How many artworks are you cataloguing at present? Yes, I was going to ask how far advanced is the cataloguing process?
I suppose we have about, I mean, it's not huge. We have about 230 oil paintings. That includes earlier versions, some of which, as you saw, were painted over. We have some old slides which could be without titles, which could be paintings that were at the New Arts Centre. Some we've been able to identify. the watercolour collection must be at least as extensive, probably rather more. But we only have, we haven't worked on that systematically yet.
And how much of the work is in fact still in the family's possession?
A great majority.
Still, yeah, okay. A question from Sally Knowles here. The scale of, yes, no question. The scale of many of the paintings you've shown us tonight are on the large side, clearly. Refreshing and confident. Did he have a large studio for storage? And or was the scale, which is almost human scale, relevant to him in connection with the subject matter? So that tendency to monumentality.
Well, they had a house which, one of the appealing features when they bought it was that it had 2 large front rooms, both of which were largely filled with canvases. The scale,
they had ceilings that were high enough for easels. That's why they bought that house.
But yes, some of he worked almost exclusively in that room, and some of the largest canvases did indeed take up a sizable amount of vertical space, as well as widespread sort of stacking around the sides of the room.
And remind us where the house was. It was
in West London.
West London. That's right. Okay. I wonder if we can shift please keep questions and comments coming. But in the meantime, I'm shift the sort of the emphasis to perhaps questions of identity. I mean, he was clearly, as indeed many Jewish and or emigre artists were, fascinated by Christian iconography, Christian imagery, even though they might have been brought up as Jews, albeit assimilated ones. And I wondered if you'd like to say something about that kind of dynamic between the Jewish and the Christian worlds, if you like. That sounds rather pretentious, but it's an interesting subject.
I think Maria may well wish to comment, but it was a general spiritual feel rather than necessarily being attached to any religion.
Maria, would you like to add something to that?
Well, I think there was a very strong interest in that side of things, a strong interest in spiritual matters, really from a what became a Christian point of view.
No, it's actually quite a rich cultural terrain, this kind of the sort of, yes, as I say, the sort of tension and the interaction between the two faiths. And yeah, indeed. And what about this question of the Holocaust? You mentioned that the large majority of the family perished. Did he ever talk about it, Maria? What did he make? Obviously, there are allusions to that dark past embedded in some of his work, but by no means all. How might you describe his relationship, both as a man and as a father, and an artist, to that aspect of his past?
I think, as with very many people, it's something that he didn't wish to talk about, certainly when I was a child. And there were many, many years when that was not really mentioned by him, though I did hear a certain amount from my grandmother and aunt, the 2 survivors, who lived in Paris for a while. But very much later in life, in a way, perhaps he became able to talk about it a bit more. And that's when it came out in some watercolors and in the painting that you saw. Certainly there were stages where, and again, I'm sure he was not alone, where one would ask perhaps a question and he would say, well, you must just remember that it all ended very badly. It was another world, in a way, that had been cut off.
As you say, not uncommon, I suppose, a self-defense mechanism on a very profound level. Indeed, indeed. I'm noticing the time. It's probably close to the time that we should wind up and think about things like supper, but so now's everybody's last chance to have their say. But perhaps we could conclude, at least on my part. Well, actually, yeah, I mean, various things again to do with identity. I was struck there was the Terence Mullally passage, obviously appreciative, in contrast to some of the other more sort of puzzled responses to the work. But he talked about I can't remember the exact phrasing, but basically he used the term intensely Polish. How does that work in the case of an artist who actually came as a very young person to this country, who clearly was fascinated by European history, but actually who made his life in this country, not just in terms of a human being, perhaps, but also in terms of where he stood in relation to British art. Those are big questions, probably impossible to answer, but this idea of somehow a British critic identifying him as intensely Polish, what do you make of that?
Yes, you say something first.
Yeah.
Well, I think he just, he would say that he regarded himself as very much connected with all those countries, both with Poland, with France, and with England, increasingly over his life. England was a place that he came very much increasingly to appreciate and to be very fond of. But he didn't lose his connection with Poland, and one could hear it still in the voice a bit. It was not, some people might say it was a strong accent, but it was a rather particular accent. He continued to speak Polish whenever he had the opportunity, and French. English was in many ways his fourth language, because he also learned a certain amount of German, of course, as a child, because that was what was in use by officialdom. So it was quite a complex identity, and in some ways that he found that was very constructive. In some ways it was quite painful, the sense of not feeling totally at home. But again, I'm sure that's not unusual.
No, indeed, and hence the insiders stroke outsiders, the two at the same time. Absolutely.
I could just quickly add to that by quoting Richard Morford again in his article, commenting on the National Life Stories tapes, because he wrote in this, the tapes serve strongly another important function of the National Life Story in augmenting awareness of the complexity of the connections that link individuals within our culture, even when the speaker is unaware of these. While Vilaincour may see himself and be perceived as an isolated figure, the tapes make clear the variety of ways in which either his preoccupations, his methods of evolving a painting, or both, find echoes in those of other painters in Britain in his time. And Richard,
thank you. That ties in very much with a question from Anne Briggs, thanking you for showing us beautiful, vibrant paintings of Viennese cafe culture and intellectual life. And then a question: was he very engaged with his own peers? Did he network with other contemporary artists, or did he prefer to work outside of any network? And I was indeed going to ask there, who did he consider his, well, I mean, there are 2 points really, which artists of the past did he most admire, but also which of his fellow artists working at the same time as him did he most admire and indeed possibly engage with?
He very much enjoyed the working together with people, particularly at Chelsea School of Art, and I'm sure Martha would agree with me on that. He was friends with many people there. I mean, just to mention 1 or 2 that people will have heard of. Patrick Caulfield was a contemporary there. There are people like Norman Blamey, the portraitist, Prunella Clough. I'm just sort of picking a few people, but there were many others with whom he had a very good relationship. They did a lot of talking. The staff talked to the staff, I think, a great deal, as well as to the students, from what I gather. I think Martha again could tell me more on that score. But he was certainly very interested in other art. It didn't mean that it necessarily appeared on his canvases, but he had a very lively interest in other painters and works of all periods, really. Very interested in the German Expressionists, but then also in the Impressionists, in a lot of earlier art too. Sometimes the French historical painters would be of interest, and people like Constable, or it might be Cézanne. I mean, whatever was on, he went to see it and talked about it with me.
Did he have anything to do with R.B. Kitaj at all? Because I was thinking, in the contemporary, the sort of British context, I mean, Kitaj was American of, European Jewish sort of descent, but they have something in common in the sense of the wide range of their multiple references that don't on a logical level make sense when they're all brought together, and yet they work as individual paintings and images. Did he know Kitai at all, or ever talk about him?
He certainly talked about him.
Yeah.
I unfortunately, and partly because we travelled quite a lot, I was not always aware of who he met, but certainly he would mention people in letters, and I know that he was very well aware of people of that sort, of Felix Topolsky. I mean, both my parents were also very much aware of art in other spheres. I mean, for example, they were friends with Lucy Ree, so ceramicists. They were very interested in the work of Bernard Leach, Cardew, and a lot of the modern British potters of that sort of period. So it was a very broad interest, cultural interest in general, and a lot of, I think, very fruitful conversations with people working in the arts.
Thank you. Right, there's perhaps some nice words of praise coming in, but one last question perhaps from indeed Linda Sandino, who you mentioned earlier. Have you discovered anything about Leon's work, or indeed his life, one might add, that you didn't know beforehand in the course of your researches?
Well, I certainly have, and it's been fascinating reading quite a few of the comments, the things that we have. We've got a very large archive that we've only touched the surface of his own references, his own notebooks. So I've certainly found it very helpful referring to the printed sources that we've been discovering or rediscovering in preparing for this.
And it's going to be a digital resource in the first instance, is that right?
Yes, I mean, I'm creating a catalogue using an Access database, which which certainly is the core of all of that work.
Very good. And let me know when it's finished, and I will be very happy to spread the word that it's available. Wonderful.
I have a question. I'm sorry I asked if he painted only in oil or other media.
We heard about the watercolors, and we sorry, I can't actually see who's asked
the
question. Do you want to tell us just very briefly a little bit more about the watercolors? Are they much more fluently? Are they less complex images? Less, tell us a little bit more about what they actually look like, if you can.
Not easy.
It's a shame you didn't illustrate just one or two to give us an insight.
Some of them are easier to read, I would say, because they're smaller scale. But again, there's a big range of material that they cover. He liked watercolor very much. He did a lot of watercolors, and then later on, sometimes it turned into collage. You would find that he had stuck little bits of fabric, textiles, onto the surface of the work. So quite a lot of things. But he did not work in acrylics. Early on, he had done quite a lot of printmaking too. He was a wood engraver and wood cutter. And that is something that he'd enjoyed at an early stage of his career. But later on, it was mainly oils and watercolors.
Did you know Susan Einzig at Chelsea? Is that a name that's familiar to you? She was of Berlin Jewish origin, was an influential. Susan Einzig? Is that somebody? She was primarily a book illustrator, but I wondered in the very early days whether their paths had crossed. That's
a name I know, but unfortunately, I didn't ask the right questions always at the right time.
I can put you in touch with her daughter Hetty. Susan died some years ago now, if you would like.
I've been very interested.
Yeah, absolutely. Good. Well, let me just add to that, perhaps, if I may, that there is an essay in the Insiders Outsiders companion volume, which focuses on the visual arts about the émigrés significance as teachers, because of course that is one very direct and meaningful way in which their legacy has been perpetuated. So I would urge you to check out the book. It's actually available to discount. If you go to the homepage of the Insiders Outsiders Festival.org website, you can see on there details of the book and indeed the discount code. Just also, as I think some of you will have realized, this is delightful event has been recorded, and the recording will be slightly topped and tailed, as it were, but uploaded onto the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel within a week or so, if not earlier. And I would urge you again, if you are new to Insiders Outsiders, have a browse, as it were, on that YouTube channel, because you'll find a number, many recordings now, a sort of rich resource, many of them on fine artists and other media beside. But if I could just mention that, in fact, for example, you mentioned very briefly, didn't you, the Festival of Britain? There's a lovely talk by Harriet Atkinson, who's an expert on the festival, but talking about the disproportionately large role of these emigres from Central Europe to that quintessentially British, post-war cultural event, and many other talks besides. So I would urge you to do that. What else? Yes, Lucy Reed, there's an exhibition that's just opened at Kettle's Yard, that lovely gallery in Cambridge, which some of you may already know about, and one could carry on, but I think that's a good place to stop. So thank you so much, Piers. That was beautifully presented, absolutely fascinating. Maria, very much thanks to you as well. And I hope to see some of you at other Insiders Outsiders event. It's a kind of ongoing program. I have no intention of stopping, because it's such a very rich cultural scene that I seem to have tapped into, and endlessly interesting. More thank yous coming in. I'll send you the chat, and I'll also send you the list of attendees, if that's okay with everybody. And good, so it only remains for me to say good night, keep well, and I hope to see you again, and we'll keep in touch. Thank you very much indeed. Good night.
And thank you from us. So thank you to everyone.
Bye-bye.